The harsh, fluorescent lights of Riverside General's emergency room cast sickly shadows across the linoleum floor as Malik Washington struggled to breathe. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow gasps, while his mother Carmen clutched his trembling hand. The 17-year-old's dark skin glistened with perspiration despite the hospital's aggressive air conditioning. His inhaler had failed him again. "Please, we need help," Carmen called to the triage nurse, her voice cutting through the sterile silence. The waiting room buzzed with the usual emergency department chaos. Crying babies, worried families, the distant beeping of monitors. But something felt different tonight. Electric. Dangerous. Malik's breathing became more labored. Each wheeze echoed through the cramped space like a desperate plea. His asthma attacks had been getting worse lately, triggered by stress from school, from the neighborhood, from simply existing as a young black man in a world that seemed determined to see him as a threat, rather than a teenager who just wanted to breathe freely. "Ma'am, you'll need to wait your turn," the nurse replied without looking up from her computer screen. Her fingers clicked across the keyboard with mechanical precision. No urgency, no concern, just protocol. Carmen's jaw tightened. "My son can't breathe. Look at him." The nurse finally glanced over, her expression flat and dismissive. "He's talking, so he's breathing. Take a seat." Malik tried to speak but could only manage a weak whisper. "Mom, I can't." That's when Officer Hoa Cops emerged from the security station like a storm cloud gathering momentum. His heavy boots echoed against the floor with each deliberate step. 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with cold gray eyes that seemed to catalog every person in the room as either compliant or problematic. His hand rested casually on his radio, a subtle display of authority that had become second nature. "Is there a problem here?" His voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Carmen looked up at the security guard, hope flickering in her tired eyes. "Yes. My son needs immediate attention. He's having a severe asthma attack." Hawa's gaze shifted to Malik, taking in the teenager's labored breathing. His large frame hunched forward in the plastic chair, sweat beading on his forehead. But instead of concern, something else crossed the guard's features. Suspicion. Contempt. "Looks like drug-seeking behavior to me," Hoa announced loud enough for the entire waiting room to hear. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Carmen's mouth fell open. "Excuse me. My son has documented asthma. We have his medical records. His medications." "Sure you do." Hoa stepped closer, his presence looming over the seated family. "Big kid like that. Probably looking for some opioids. We see it all the time. Fake breathing problems. Fake chest pain. Classic addict behavior." Malik's eyes widened in shock and humiliation. The wheezing intensified as panic set in. Around the waiting room, other patients and families watched in stunned silence. Some pulled out their phones, instinctively sensing that something terrible was about to unfold. "Officer, please." Carmen stood up, positioning herself between Hoa and her son. "This is ridiculous. He's 17 years old. He needs medical attention, not accusations." "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to calm down and return to your seat." Hoa's voice took on an official tone that brooked no argument. "Your son is disrupting the emergency department with his performance." Performance. Carmen's voice rose an octave. "He can barely breathe." Several nurses had gathered near the triage desk, watching the escalating situation with worried expressions. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, stepped forward. "Officer Cops, Perhaps we should let the medical staff evaluate. I'll handle this, nurse. Hoa cut her off with a dismissive wave. This is a security matter now. Malik tried to stand, his movements slow and deliberate as he fought for each breath. I just need my inhaler. Sit down, Hoa barked, his hand moving to his belt where a taser hung like a silent threat. Don't you dare move. The command echoed through the emergency room like a gunshot. Every person present felt the violence simmering just beneath the surface. Carmen's maternal instincts kicked into overdrive. Don't you touch my son. She moved protectively in front of Malik, her small frame dwarfed by the security guard's imposing figure. What happened next would be replayed on social media thousands of times over the following weeks. Hoa Cops. His patience, apparently exhausted by what he perceived as defiance, grabbed Malik by the arm with unnecessary force. The teenager, already weakened by his breathing difficulties, stumbled forward. I said sit down. Hoa yanked Malik back toward the chair, but the boy's legs gave out. He crashed to the floor, his breathing becoming even more desperate. Carmen screamed. The sound cut through the emergency room like broken glass. Get off him, he can't breathe. But Hoa wasn't finished. Interpreting Malik's collapse as resistance, he dropped to one knee and pressed his weight against the teenager's back. Stop resisting, he shouted, even though Malik was clearly incapacitated. The scene was horrific. A sick teenager, fighting for breath, pinned to a hospital floor by a security guard who seemed determined to prove some twisted point about authority and control. Around them, patients and staff watched in horror as medical emergency transformed into police brutality. He's turning blue, someone shouted from the crowd. Indeed, Malik's lips had taken on a dusky purple hue. His fingernails showed the telltale signs of oxygen deprivation. Carmen dropped to her knees beside her son, tears streaming down her face. Please, somebody help us call a doctor. That's when Dr. Angela Thompson rounded the corner from the cardiac wing. She had been heading to the break room when the commotion reached her ears. A woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and intelligent brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Dr. Thompson commanded respect wherever she went. As Riverside General's chief of medicine, she had seen every conceivable medical emergency and human tragedy. But nothing had prepared her for what she witnessed in that moment. Her nephew Malik, the boy she had helped raise after his father died, was being brutalized on the floor of her own emergency department. The air left her lungs as if she had been punched in the stomach. What the hell is going on here? Her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades making life-and-death decisions. Hoa looked up, still maintaining his position on Malik's back. Medical situation under control, doctor. Just dealing with a drug seeker. Get off him! Now! Doctor. Thompson's words were ice-cold and razor-sharp. Ma'am, I don't think you understand. I understand perfectly. She stepped closer, her presence radiating barely controlled fury. That's my nephew you're assaulting, and he's in acute respiratory distress. Remove your hands from him immediately, or I will have you arrested for assault. The revelation hit the emergency room like a thunderbolt. Hoa's grip loosened involuntarily as the implications sank in. Carmen looked up through her tears, recognition dawning on her face. Angela. Doctor. Thompson dropped to her knees beside Malik, her medical training taking over despite the personal stakes. Get me an albuterol nebulizer and call respiratory therapy. Stat, she ordered to the gathering medical staff. Hoa slowly released his hold on Malik, but his face showed no remorse, only calculation. Doctor, this individual was being disruptive and appeared to be seeking narcotics. That individual, Dr. Thompson said without looking up from her nephew, is a 17-year-old honor student with severe asthma who comes to this hospital regularly for legitimate medical care. And you just assaulted him in front of dozens of witnesses. The nurses worked quickly to help Malik into a wheelchair. His breathing was still labored, but the relief of being free from Hoa's weight was immediately visible. Carmen gripped her son's hand while Dr. Thompson checked his vital signs with practiced efficiency. Oxygen saturation is at 87%, one of the nurses reported. Heart rate 140. Room 3, now, Dr. Thompson ordered. And someone call security, the real security, to escort Officer Cops off the premises. But Hoa wasn't going quietly. You can't throw me out. I work here. I was doing my job, maintaining order. Your job. Dr. Thompson stood slowly, her 5'4" frame somehow towering over the larger man, is to provide security and assistance to patients and families, not to assault sick children based on your personal prejudices. The emergency room had become deathly quiet, except for the mechanical sounds of medical equipment. Every eye was fixed on the confrontation between the respected physician and the increasingly defensive security guard. Prejudices. Hoa's voice rose defensively. I don't see color. I see behavior. The kid was acting suspicious. His mother was being aggressive. Stop. Dr. Thompson's word cut through his excuses like a scalpel. Just stop. I've watched the security footage. I've seen how you treat certain patients differently than others. This ends now. Carmen had followed Malik's wheelchair toward the treatment room, but turned back when she heard her sister-in-law's words. The two women hadn't spoken in months, not since a family disagreement had driven a wedge between them. But in this moment, all of that seemed insignificant. Angela, I didn't know you worked here, Carmen said softly. I'm the chief of medicine, Dr. Thompson replied, her voice gentle now. And I'm deeply sorry this happened to Malik. To both of you. In treatment room 3, medical staff worked to stabilize Malik's breathing. The nebulizer delivered bronchodilating medication directly to his lungs, while monitors tracked his vital signs. Slowly, the numbers improved. His oxygen saturation climbed back toward normal levels. The fear in his eyes began to fade, replaced by exhaustion. How are you feeling, sweetheart? Carmen asked, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. Better, Malik whispered, his voice still hoarse but stronger. Mom, did that really happen? Did he really? Yes, baby. But it's over now. You're safe. Dr. Thompson entered the room after ensuring Hoa had been escorted from the building by hospital security. She pulled up a chair beside the hospital bed, her professional demeanor softening as she looked at her nephew. Malik, I owe you an apology. What happened out there was inexcusable. No patient should ever be treated that way in our hospital. The teenager studied his aunt's face. They had been close when he was younger, before family politics complicated their relationship. Aunt Angie, you don't have to apologize for him. Yes, I do. As chief of medicine, I'm responsible for everything that happens in this building, including hiring decisions that put people like Officer Cops in positions of authority. Carmen shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Angela, we haven't talked in so long. I had no idea you were working here when we came in tonight. I've been here for 3 years, when David died. Dr. Thompson's voice caught slightly at the mention of Carmen's late husband, her younger brother. I transferred here to be closer to family, to be closer to you and Malik. The unspoken tension in the room was palpable. Family wounds that had never properly healed. Arguments about money, about responsibility, about who should have done more to help after David's sudden death from a heart attack at 39. I tried calling, Carmen said quietly, after the funeral. But you were so busy with your career, your new position. I was hurt, Dr. Thompson admitted. When you said I cared more about my job than family, but I should have tried harder to bridge that gap. Malik looked between the two women who had helped shape his life. His breathing was nearly normal now, but the emotional weight in the room felt just as suffocating as his asthma attack. Can we maybe talk about this later? He asked softly. I'm really tired. Both women immediately refocused on him, their familial love overriding their personal conflicts. Doctor, Thompson checked his chart and nodded with satisfaction at the improved numbers. Your breathing is much better. We'll keep you for observation for a few more hours, but you should be able to go home tonight. Outside the treatment room, word of the incident was spreading rapidly. Several patients and family members had recorded parts of the altercation on their phones. Within hours, social media would be flooded with videos showing Hoa Cops violently restraining a sick teenager while his mother screamed for help. But the immediate concern was Malik's well-being and ensuring that nothing like this could happen again. Dr. Thompson called an emergency meeting with the hospital administration, demanding immediate action. We have a serious problem, she told the assembled administrators in the conference room, adjacent to the emergency department. This incident represents everything wrong with our patient care protocols and security procedures. Hospital Administrator Richard Morrison, a thin man in his 60s, who seemed more comfortable with spreadsheets than people, shifted nervously in his seat. Angela, I understand you're upset because of your personal connection to the patient. This has nothing to do with personal connections. Dr. Thompson's voice was steel. This is about a pattern of discriminatory behavior that we've failed to address. How many other patients has Officer Cops treated with similar aggression? How many families have been traumatized in our emergency department? The uncomfortable silence that followed spoke volumes. Everyone in the room knew there had been complaints about Hoa's behavior before. Complaints that had been filed away and forgotten, dismissed as misunderstandings or personality conflicts. We need to conduct a full investigation, offered Dr. Patricia Reeves, the Director of Patient Services. Review all security incidents involving Officer Cops. We need to do more than investigate, Dr. Thompson replied. We need to acknowledge that this hospital has failed its most vulnerable patients. We need to implement mandatory bias training for all staff. We need community oversight of our security practices. Morrison looked uncomfortable with the scope of the proposed changes. Angela, let's not overreact. One incident doesn't necessarily indicate a systemic problem. One incident. Dr. Thompson's voice rose dangerously. Richard, I've been documenting concerning behaviors for months. Security calls that were excessive for the situations. Patients of color being questioned about drug seeking when white patients with identical symptoms were treated without suspicion. Tonight wasn't an isolated incident. It was the inevitable result of our failure to act. The meeting continued for 2 hours as Dr. Thompson laid out a comprehensive plan for addressing the hospital's cultural problems. Some administrators resisted, worried about liability and public relations consequences. Others recognized the moral imperative to do better. Meanwhile, the story was gaining traction online. Riverside General began trending on Twitter as people shared videos and expressed outrage at what they had witnessed. Local news stations picked up the story, leading with headlines about hospital security assaulting a sick teenager. By morning, protesters had gathered outside Riverside General demanding accountability. They carried signs reading, "Healthcare is a right," and "Justice for Malik." The crowd was diverse black families who had experienced similar treatment, white allies who recognized systemic injustice, medical professionals appalled by the violation of patient care principles. Carmen found herself thrust into the role of reluctant spokesperson as reporters sought her perspective on the incident. Standing outside the hospital where her son had been traumatized just hours earlier, she struggled to find words that could adequately express her anger and pain. "My son came here for medical help," she told the cameras, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "He was sick, he was scared, and instead of receiving the care he needed, he was brutalized by someone who was supposed to protect him." The reporter, a young woman with an earnest expression, pressed for more details. "Mrs. Washington, what changes do you want to see at Riverside General?" Carmen thought about her conversation with Angela the night before, about family wounds and missed opportunities for connection, about the broader wounds in their community that needed healing. "I want accountability," she said finally, "not just for Officer Cops, but for the systems that allowed this to happen. I want training for staff so they see patients as human beings, not threats. I want my son and every other child to feel safe when they need medical care." Inside the hospital, Dr. Thompson was fielding calls from colleagues, administrators, and advocacy groups. The story had resonated far beyond their local community, touching a nerve about healthcare disparities and institutional racism. "Dr. Thompson, this is Marcus Johnson from the NAACP." One caller introduced himself. "We've been following the Malik, Washington case. We'd like to offer our support for any reforms you're implementing." Similar calls came from the American Medical Association, patient advocacy groups, and civil rights organizations. Each offered resources and expertise for addressing the systemic issues that had enabled the previous night's incident. The pressure for change was mounting rapidly, but Dr. Thompson knew that sustainable reform required more than external pressure. It required internal commitment from hospital staff and administration to examine their own biases and practices. She organized a staff meeting for that afternoon, mandatory for all emergency department personnel. The large conference room was packed with doctors, nurses, technicians, and support staff. The mood was tense, defensive in some cases, but also reflective. "I want to start by acknowledging that we failed Malik Washington," Dr. Thompson began. "We failed him as medical professionals and as human beings. But this is also an opportunity to recommit ourselves to the principles that brought us into healthcare." Nurse Jennifer Martinez, who had witnessed the entire incident, raised her hand tentatively. "Dr. Thompson, I wanted to intervene, but I wasn't sure how. I was afraid of making things worse." "Thank you for being honest, Jennifer. That's exactly the kind of reflection we need. How do we create an environment where staff feel empowered to advocate for patients, even when that means challenging authority figures?" The discussion that followed was difficult, but necessary. Staff members shared experiences of feeling uncomfortable with certain security interventions, but not knowing how to respond. Others admitted to their own unconscious biases in patient assessment and treatment. Dr. Robert Chen, a veteran emergency physician, spoke up with obvious discomfort. "I have to admit, I've sometimes made assumptions about patients based on their appearance or demographics. This incident has forced me to examine those assumptions." The honesty was painful, but productive. For the first time in years, the emergency department staff was having frank conversations about race, bias, and patient care. It was the beginning of the cultural transformation Dr. Thompson had been advocating for. 3 days after the incident, Riverside General's Board of Directors held an emergency meeting to address the crisis. The public pressure was intense, with protesters maintaining a constant presence outside the hospital and media coverage showing no signs of diminishing. Board Chairman William Foster, a wealthy businessman with limited healthcare experience, seemed primarily concerned about the hospital's reputation and financial liability. "We need to contain this situation quickly, settle with the family quietly, and move on." But Dr. Thompson pushed back forcefully. "William, this isn't a public relations problem to be managed. This is a moral crisis that requires fundamental change. If we simply pay the family and continue business as usual, we've learned nothing." Board member Dr. Sarah Kim, one of the few practicing physicians on the board, supported Thompson's position. "Angela is right. We have a responsibility to our community that goes beyond avoiding lawsuits. We need to demonstrate real commitment to equitable care." The debate continued for hours, but eventually, the board agreed to implement the comprehensive reform package Dr. Thompson had proposed. Officer Hoa Cop was terminated immediately. His security license revoked. All hospital security personnel would undergo mandatory de-escalation and bias training. A community oversight committee would be established to monitor patient care practices. Most significantly, the hospital committed to hiring a director of health equity who would work to identify and eliminate disparities in patient treatment. It was an unprecedented response that exceeded what most advocacy groups had dared to hope for. When the reforms were announced at a press conference the following week, Carmen Washington stood beside Dr. Thompson as they addressed the media and community members. The two women had spent hours reconciling their relationship, finding their way back to the family bond that had sustained them through David's death and its aftermath. Change is never easy, Dr. Thompson told the assembled crowd. But crisis can be a catalyst for growth and improvement. Malik's courage in sharing his story has created an opportunity for our entire healthcare system to do better. Carmen nodded as she stepped up to the microphone. "My son didn't choose to become the face of this issue, but he's committed to using his experience to help other families. No child should have to fear seeking medical care." Malik himself had initially resisted the public attention, preferring to focus on his recovery and schoolwork. But as letters of support poured in from around the country, many from other young people who had experienced similar discrimination, he began to understand the broader significance of his story. "I'm not a hero," he told a reporter during a follow-up interview. "I'm just a kid who wanted to breathe. But if what happened to me can prevent it from happening to someone else, then maybe something good can come from something really bad." The transformation at Riverside General was gradual, but noticeable. Staff members reported feeling more comfortable intervening when they witnessed inappropriate behavior. Patient satisfaction scores improved, particularly among communities of color who had previously felt unwelcome. 6 months after the incident, the hospital hosted its first community health fair, an event designed to build trust and provide preventive care services to underserved populations. Malik served as a youth ambassador, sharing his story and encouraging other young people to advocate for their own healthcare needs. Standing in the same emergency department where he had been assaulted, Malik reflected on how much had changed. The physical space looked the same, but the atmosphere was different, more welcoming, more respectful, more human. "It's weird being back here," he admitted to his mother as they prepared for the health fair's opening ceremony. Carmen squeezed his hand supportively. "Are you okay? We can leave if you need to." "No, I'm good. It's actually kind of healing. You know, seeing all these families getting the care they need without being treated like criminals." "Doctor." Thompson approached them, wearing the same white coat she had worn the night of the incident. But her demeanor was lighter now. The weight of unaddressed systemic problems had been lifted, replaced by the energizing challenge of building something better. "Malik, are you ready for your presentation? The community health educators are excited to hear from you." The teenager nodded, his confidence having grown significantly over the past months. Speaking engagements at schools and community centers had helped him process his trauma while developing his voice as an advocate. "Aunt Angie, do you think things will really stay changed? Like, what happens when people stop paying attention?" "Doctor," Thompson considered the question seriously. "Change requires constant vigilance, but we've built structures and accountability measures that should help sustain the progress. More importantly, we've changed hearts and minds. That's harder to undo." The health fair drew hundreds of families throughout the day. Community members who had previously avoided Riverside General returned tentatively, testing whether the promised changes were real. They found a hospital transformed not just in policies and procedures, but in culture and commitment. During the closing ceremony, Malik took the stage to address the assembled crowd. His presentation had evolved over months of practice, but the core message remained constant. Healthcare is a human right that must be accessible to everyone, regardless of race, size, age, or any other characteristic. 6 months ago, I came to this hospital because I couldn't breathe. He began, his voice clear and strong. I left traumatized but determined to make sure no other kid goes through what I experienced. Today, I can breathe easily, not just because my asthma is well controlled, but because I know this community has my back. The applause was thunderous, but Malik wasn't finished. Change is possible when people are willing to confront uncomfortable truths and do the hard work of making things better. Thank you to everyone who refused to let my story be forgotten. Thank you to the hospital staff, who are committed to treating every patient with dignity and respect. As the crowd dispersed, families lingered to speak with hospital staff and community leaders. Relationships were being built that would extend far beyond the health fair. Trust was being rebuilt one conversation at a time. Carmen watched her son pose for photos with other young advocates and community members. The shy, frightened teenager who had struggled to breathe in this same building had become a confident voice for change. The trauma hadn't disappeared, but it had been transformed into purpose. "He's amazing," Dr. Thompson said, joining Carmen near the stage. "David would be so proud." "He would," Carmen agreed, her voice thick with emotion. "Both of how Malik has grown and of how you've led this change process. I'm proud too. Angela, proud to be your family." The reconciliation between the two women had been one of the unexpected gifts of the crisis. Their shared commitment to Malik's well-being had reminded them of what truly mattered: family, community, and the obligation to care for one another. As the sun set over Riverside General, the emergency department prepared for another night of serving their community. But this time was different. Staff members had the tools and training they needed to provide equitable care. Policies ensured accountability, and the community knew they had advocates within the system who would fight for their rights. Malik's breathing was easy and steady as he walked through the hospital corridors one last time before heading home. The same hallways where he had experienced his worst moment had become the setting for his greatest triumph. Not because he had defeated a single security guard, but because he had helped transform an entire system. The boy who had come seeking breath had given voice to an entire community's concerns. His story would continue to ripple outward, inspiring other hospitals to examine their practices, other young people to find their voices, and other families to demand the dignity they deserved. In the end, Malik Washington had done more than survive his ordeal at Riverside General. He had breathed life into a movement for healthcare justice that would outlast any single incident or individual. And in a world that too often sought to silence young voices, especially young Black voices, he had proven that sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is simply refusing to be invisible. The emergency room doors opened and closed throughout the night, welcoming patients of all backgrounds with the promise that they would be seen, heard, and treated with the respect that every human being deserves. It was a promise written not in policy manuals or press releases, but in the transformed hearts of a community that had learned to breathe together